Now let me go back here and, okay. On August 7th, 1942, there was an important briefing at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Senior officers of the Imperial Army gathered to listen to a briefing by Colonel Sugita, who was an intelligence officer of the Imperial Japanese Army. Sugita began by discussing the progress of the war to date, which from both Japan's and Sugita's personal standpoint had been highly satisfactory. Sugita had participated in the campaign ending in the British surrender at Singapore, as you see there in the slide, and he covered events up to that date. He then turned to the task that intelligence officers routinely face, which is trying to project what the opponent will next do. And Sugita announced that in his view it was very unlikely that the U.S. would strike anywhere along Japan's broad Pacific frontier, that the most likely American move was to attempt to secure from the Soviets heavy bomber bases in Soviet maritime provinces northwest of Japan, and from those bases attempt to mount a strategic bombing campaign against Japan. That exact same day, U.S. Marines splashed ashore on the then very obscure island of Guadalcanal. Now, Guadalcanal is at a bearing of almost 180 degrees at a distance of over 4,900 nautical miles from where Sugita had projected the Americans were going to put up bomber bases. This briefing proved to be a turning point in Colonel Sugita's career. When we next encounter him, he's now an intelligence officer, but he's on the island of Guadalcanal itself, working with the Japanese 17th Army, and we'll come back to his fate and that army's fate a little later.
Rich, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but it looks like the slides aren't advancing on our side. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe just try this for me one more time. Just maybe stop sharing the screen if you can, and then maybe reshare it, and maybe that'll work.
Okay.
Yeah, we still see that title slide.
Still see the title slide? Did that do anything?
I still see the title slide. So yeah, if you hit that that button that looks like a like the play button, if you hit it, it'll turn into pause, and if you click it again, maybe it'll advance. There we go. We can see it now.
Now you see it? Okay. Let me see whether that'll... Oops. Let me try again here. Sorry for the problem.
It says far right at Singapore surrender.
Yeah, okay. Well, let me try to get it scrolled down. There we go.
Oh, there we go. It's working now.
Okay. With respect to how the Guadalcanal campaign fitted in strategically for the U.S., this slide pretty much tells the story. I mean, we're aiming for the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers, but we prioritize going after Germany. With respect to Japan and the Asia-Pacific theater, we're really looking to keep China in the war and to secure Australia and New Zealand, which is the essential background to the whole campaign. I'm still having trouble here with, oh, there we go. Oh, I see now what I've got to do. Okay. For the Japanese, of course, they believe they're in a limited war, and their aim is to seize an empire that's be self-sustaining and also to eventually exhaust the U.S. and its allies so that they secure a negotiated peace that will eventually secure their empire that they've just seized by force in Asia and the Pacific. Their problem is that they have essentially mortgaged their whole strategy to the notion that Germany is going to defeat both the Soviet Union and probably the United Kingdom. This proves to be a very poor bet on their part. The reason why we have a Guadalcanal campaign is not due to impersonal forces, but essentially due to one individual, Admiral Ernest J. King, who at that point is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet. The photograph you see in this slide is widely believed to be the only photograph of Admiral King taken during the war in which he's smiling. He was a notoriously tough-minded individual who prided himself on being the toughest son of a bitch there was. The slide gives you the general idea about what the rationale that King was thinking about when he proposed and secured agreement to this campaign. He was convinced that after Midway, the Japanese should be given no respite. He was probably the first member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who fully comprehended the American industrial output was going to permit offensives in both Europe and the Pacific. General Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, agreed to go along with this, and interestingly, part of the rationale that Marshall was thinking of was that because his own plan for a U.S. landing on Northwest Europe in 1942 had been stymied by the British, that the one thing the U.S. could do to sustain the Soviets, which was regarded as absolutely essential in the war, was to keep the Japanese off their back by keeping the Japanese occupied with an offensive in the Pacific. And finally, immediately after Midway, General Douglas MacArthur proposed an offensive in his area, the Southwest Pacific area, and Admiral King was bureaucratically intending to head off any effort by General MacArthur to take command of Pacific strategy. And here is the Pacific Ocean area, and you'll see the red star marking just to the left of that is the label Solomon Islands. If you look just sort of southwest of that, you'll see the island of Guadalcanal, which is the central subject for our topic today. This is the fundamental operational area we're going to be dealing with. In the upper left is Rabaul, which is the principal Japanese base in the whole region. It's a superb harbor. It has a multiple airfield complex, some with concrete runways, which are virtually unheard of in this part of the world. And the Solomon Islands are laid out, as often been described, as like a set of footprints marching south from New Ireland. The area between the islands, the Americans are going to call the slot, be the subject of much back and forth by naval forces. And of course, you'll see the island of Guadalcanal, and marked on that is the most essential feature of the whole campaign in terms of the island of Guadalcanal, which is Henderson Field, the main airfield on Guadalcanal. Now, Admiral King wins agreement with General Marshall to authorize what's called Operation Pestilence on July 2nd, 1942. It's conceived as a three-phase operation, the first phase of which is going to produce the Guadalcanal campaign, is phase one, and it designates that its objective to Tulagi and adjacent positions. This is Operation Watchtower. What's curious about this is in the original order, the island of Guadalcanal is not even mentioned. Now, the campaign is envisioned as involving a second phase involving the seizure of the rest of the Solomons, and then positions on New Guinea, followed by a direct attack on Rabaul. That, of course, is not how things are going to play out. The United States Marine Corps official history has this very circumspect statement: seldom has an operation begun under more disadvantageous circumstances. And let's do our pre-operation checklist to see just what the Marines are talking about. Well, first of all, intelligence is deficit. There's really no real knowledge about the target area, and there will be no map that will guide American forces during the entire campaign. The planning is done in an extraordinary tempo. The operation is ordered on the 2nd of July. The landing takes place on the 7th of August. There is planning going on simultaneously at all levels. It's not sort of top-down ideal planning mode that we become accustomed to later in the Pacific. There's a rehearsal, which unfortunately is an area picked by map, which proves to be impossible for some of the landings to take place. So it's pretty much ineffective. There's a commander's conference in which is revealed the sharp divisions among the commanders about what the objectives and duration of the operation are going to be. And finally, afterwards, when people are looking back on this, there's one particular naval officer who's heavily involved in logistical planning in 1944-45, who says that if anyone with the experience that they had had by that point had looked at the plan, they would have pronounced the Guadalcanal campaign as being impossible, and indeed logistics remains a weak point throughout the campaign. Notwithstanding all of these deficits, the landing itself, the original landing on the 7th of August, takes off in great fashion. The strategic, operational, and tactical surprise are gained. The Americans seized their key objectives, including particularly the airfield on Guadalcanal that's going to be named Henderson Field after a Marine flyer lost at Midway. There's pretty severe fighting that goes on across the bay from Guadalcanal at Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambago, but that operation is also over within a couple days. After this wonderful beginning, then lurch to catastrophe. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, the Japanese 8th Fleet commander, puts together a scratch task force of cruisers and a destroyer, sails down, and inflicts upon the United States Navy what's probably the most humiliating defeat it suffered at sea in wartime in its entire history, sinking 3 American and 1 Australian cruiser, and basically forcing the withdrawal of the support force, the transports, to support the operation. This is a simplified track chart of what Savo Island is like. You'll see the Japanese come down from the northwest, simply circle Savo Island, blast the two cruiser covering forces, but fortunately withdraw before they attack the vital transports, which would have produced a complete catastrophe. Well, notwithstanding the fact that the Japanese have seemingly gained the upper hand, the fact is the strategic surprise is a gift, as I say, keeps on giving. Basically, the Japanese are still convinced that the major U.S. offensive in the Pacific could not take place until 1943, and therefore they are inclined to deprecate what's going on at Guadalcanal. They think it's either a raid or a very small operation. And their first instinct is to send merely a regimental group under Colonel Keanu Ichiki to basically deal with the Americans on Guadalcanal. Meanwhile, the Marines get their supplies within the perimeter, they having landed somewhat to the east of it, and they also put the airfield, which the Japanese had partly completed, into full operation. It's a mark of the problem with the planning of the operation that the first American planes don't arrive to occupy the airfield until the 20th of August. In terms of long-range American military history, however, this is a very important benchmark because these planes are going to be the seed of what's going to become called the Cactus Air Force, Cactus being the code name for Guadalcanal. And eventually it will be an all-arms, at least in terms of American organization at that time, there's the Army, Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines, will jointly be operating aircraft from Guadalcanal under one single command. And this is, I believe, in American military history, the first true unified command of American forces. Everything prior to that was done with the Army and the Navy was by cooperation, not by unity of command. The great thinkers on military strategy, Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, I found to be rather weak on dive bombing. Well, Ichiki comes down very full of himself, as was Japanese Imperial Army officers were at that point, because they'd had almost unbroken string of successes from December 1941, and he very rashly moves down to attack the airfield, marching along the coast against the advice that he'd been told to be a little more cautious. And basically, the Marines halt his attempt to attack across a place called the Tenaru River. At least that's what we call it at the time. It's actually Alligator Creek. And then the next day, the Marines encircle and annihilate Ichiki's command. Now, this operation, this Battle of Tenaru, would scarcely merit notice on the Eastern Front or elsewhere in Europe, but in the Pacific, it's a very big deal. It's arguably, I would maintain, the most important small battle of the Pacific War. Up to that point in time, there were no Americans who'd engaged the Japanese on land who were not either dead or prisoners of the Japanese. There was no understanding institutionally in the American armed forces of what facing Imperial Japan was exactly going to be like. And in the aftermath of the annihilation of, or virtual annihilation of Ichiki's command, American Marines and Navy corpsmen move across the battlefield seeking to take prisoners and to treat wounded. They are rudely surprised by the fact that Japanese not only refuse to be taken prisoner, but many of them commit acts trying to kill their would-be helpers. The Marines, including General Archer Vandegrift, the Marine commander, are absolutely shocked by this. And this idea that the Japanese are not going to surrender resonates throughout American forces across the Pacific. This had been followed shortly before by a small skirmish involving a Marine patrol that's annihilated, in which the Marines determined the Japanese were not taking prisoners. Thus was set from this small skirmish or small battle on Guadalcanal what's going to be eventually the view that the American armed forces are going to have of the Japanese, at least fighting on land, for the entire rest of the Pacific War. Now, the Japanese, to support Ichiki, send down major portions of their naval forces called the Combined Fleet, and these engage in what becomes the third carrier battle of the war, called the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on the 24th of October, 1942. I'm not going to go into the details of the battle, but the one point I would like to make is that Admiral Frank Dak Fletcher, who has frequently been criticized for his conduct around Guadalcanal, had presently said beforehand that he believed the Japanese were not going to quietly abide the American seizure of Guadalcanal and would react with the greatest violence. And he recognized that his carrier force was going to have to fight a big battle in order to save the island and the garrison. And this comes true at the Eastern Solomons. The one thing about this battle that is significant, you'll see in the lowest level of this slide, is in aircrew losses. There's an extreme disparity between the loss of aviation personnel between the U.S. and Japan. And this is a harbinger of everything else that's going to come during the next 6 weeks. After the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, there's a very curious operational situation that develops with respect to Guadalcanal. And that is that the sea control off the island of Guadalcanal changes about every 12 hours with the sunrise and the sunset. Now this slide shows you, again, the area around Guadalcanal. As long as the Americans can hold Henderson Field and can use its airfield, they can put up fighter aircraft to defend the immediate anchorage area, and the Navy is going to be able to bring in some transport ships to provide supplies to the Marines and later the soldiers that are on Guadalcanal. Not much, but it's enough to keep them from going into absolute starvation. The Japanese, on the other hand, are inhibited by the fact that American dive bombers and some other attack planes based on Guadalcanal can fly up the slot, basically up to about the level. If you look at the label, the slot, you look at where the first parentheses are, that's about the limit of the range of dive bombers on Guadalcanal. And this forces the Japanese to use night runs at high speed by destroyers to come down from Rabaul and later the Shortland Islands to get just within under that umbrella that we have over the center of the slot, then down to Guadalcanal and dump off troops and supplies. Of course, the problem is the Japanese are unable to provide anything like adequate levels of supplies by this method, which the Americans are soon calling the Tokyo Express because it runs like an express railway line of that era. This is going to be a critical feature of the whole campaign. Now, having failed in August to eject the Americans from Guadalcanal, the Japanese, in a pattern of piecemeal commitment, decide if we try a regimental group, the next step up is a brigade, and they send a brigade under a general named Kawaguchi. Now, Kawaguchi is probably the most astute Japanese army commander who's going to serve on Guadalcanal. He does not deprecate the Americans, and he comes up with what originally was a pretty good plan. His idea was that the Americans do not have a complete perimeter around the airfield and their enclave around the airfield, and therefore he's going to march around south and attack through what he thinks is the undefended area south of the airfield and break through, seize the airfield, and end the American occupation of Guadalcanal. Well, when he first starts out, this plan is very sound, but fortunately the Marines detect Kawaguchi's movement and determined that he's very likely to attack on this terrain feature south of the airfield that's later going to be called Edson's Ridge. Well, the Japanese strike on 2 nights in September 1943 in furious close-range jungle fighting. It's probably as close as they ever come on the ground to taking Guadalcanal. It's a very, very near-run thing. It's held by the leadership of Edson and some other Marine officers, raw courage by the Marines, and pretty heavy artillery support, which backs up the Marines as they are basically pushed back along that ridge until they make a final stand. There's a rough sketch of what the battle is like. You'll see the Kawaguchi's force coming up from the south across the ridge, and how the Marines defend that ridge, preventing the Japanese from getting to the airfield complex. Well, after the September battle, the Americans are able to move in the first reinforcements of their ground forces. The 7th Marine Regiment is brought up. Unfortunately, in covering that movement, the U.S. carrier Wasp is sunk by a Japanese submarine. The Japanese, meanwhile, are making new plans, and now they're getting a lot more serious about the level of commitment they're going to have against Guadalcanal, and this time, having tried a regimental team or a reinforced battalion, a brigade, now it's going to be a division. In fact, the Imperial Army's 2nd Sendai Division, one of the crack units in the Imperial Army. And the plan now is that they're going to try to suppress the American air power on Guadalcanal by both an air campaign and a ferocious bombardment by Japanese battleships. Then they will move down a reinforcement convoy to land troops, and those troops will then seize Guadalcanal. This leads to a series of battles in mid-October 1942. It starts off with a cruiser-destroyer battle called the Battle of Cape Esperance. An American commander, Rear Admiral Norman Scott, actually managed to win a victory at night against the Japanese. This American success, however, and once again this pattern of roller coaster rides, is immediately offset the next night by what the Marines are going to call the bombardment. Now, the Marines on Guadalcanal are bombarded by Japanese naval vessels more than 60 times during the course of the campaign. This is a night, however, in which 2 Japanese battleships come down and unload almost 1,000 14-inch shells on the American perimeter. This is arguably the most severe individual bombardment any American troops have ever faced in the history of the United States. The bombardment does succeed in knocking out American air power. The Japanese are then able to move a convoy down and commence landing in broad daylight beyond the American perimeter to the west, within eyesight, in fact, of the American perimeter. At this point, the prospects for the Marines and the American garrison on Guadalcanal looks extremely grim. In fact, in Washington, it's now believed that it's quite likely that Guadalcanal is going to end in an ignominious defeat. Part of the reaction to this is a decision to start releasing far more candid information about what's going on Guadalcanal and the severe crisis that the American forces are facing. With this crisis comes a command change. Admiral Nimitz, Master Chester W. Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, in one of his best moves in the whole war, decides that the theater commander, who up to that point had been Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, was not up to the task, and decides he will replace him with Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. Halsey takes command, has a command conference with the Marine commander, General Archer Vandegrift, and in that conference, General Vandegrift is asked, what do you need? And Vandegrift says to Halsey, we just need more support than we've been getting. And if Vandegrift had taken a spear and chucked it into Halsey's chest, he probably couldn't have wounded him more, because the obvious implication is the Navy is not holding up its end, and this really strikes right to the heart of Admiral Halsey's views about how war is fought and how the role of the U.S. Navy is. Now, this also leads to an interesting aspect I like to talk about when I do my talks to the Naval War College. That involves Admiral Halsey's Chief of Staff, Miles Browning. I like to depict Miles Browning as a martyr principle, or an interesting principle for which I've invented an abbreviation, SODO. Basically, what you have to understand about Miles Browning is that when Admiral Halsey is sick, just before the Battle of Midway, Admiral Raymond Spruance takes over for him at Halsey's recommendation, but Spruance takes Miles Browning as his Chief of Staff, as Halsey had. Well, Midway, of course, is a great American victory. Miles Browning is the Chief of Staff of the victorious, one of the victorious admirals in command. His career has just taken a great turn for the better. He comes back from the battle, however, and decides, as part of his celebration, he's going to have a little frolic with the wife of another officer. Now, if Browning had picked the wife of an Army officer, he might have gotten a letter of commendation. If he'd picked the wife of an Army Air Force officer, the younger the better, we're looking at an award somewhere probably between the Legion of Merit and the Distinguished Service Medal. But Miles Browning chose to commit his adultery with the wife of a brother naval officer, and he was caught, pummeled by the brother officer, and this got to Admiral Nimitz, and that ended Miles Browning's prospects of achieving flag command. This leads to the principle I've noted, which is always think joint. Whether it's strategy, operations, tactics, or adultery, always think joint. Well, those Japanese forces that have landed in October now have to make a decision about how to go about seizing and conquering the American position on Guadalcanal. The Japanese commanders look at the situation, notice their paucity of supplies, and particularly ammunition, and realize that if they try to attack the obvious place, which is closer down to the coastline, they're apt to get into a firepower confrontation they cannot win. Some of their officers go up on a high ground overlooking the American position called Mount Austin, look down, and deduce from their observation that the terrain south of the American perimeter, although jungle-clad, looks reasonably passable. They look at the map they've been provided by the Imperial Navy, and it also seems to show that the contour lines are such that this is passable terrain for the stalwart soldiers of the Imperial Army. The problem is that what the Japanese officers do not realize is the Imperial Navy has provided them only with a chart that had been prepared originally by the British Admiralty. Now, those Admiralty charts are quite accurate normally with respect to areas covered by water and the close shorelines. It's a convention, however, in British Admiralty charts that when it comes to distances far inland, some clerk in some office, after they make the main part of the chart, simply sketches in freehand a few contour lines to suggest that there's some terrain there inland. And so it's totally deceptive, and the Japanese officers fall for the notion that this is a pretty simple march. The Marines, on the other hand, are very concerned. They understand that they not only have to maintain physically a grip on Henderson Field, but they have to keep the Japanese at such a distance the Japanese cannot, by either mortar or artillery fire, interdict the American use of the airfield. If the Americans ever lost the use of the airfield and its now satellites, that would be the end of the American garrison on Guadalcanal. So the Marines believe that the most likely Japanese move is to come in towards the shoreline, where they can move their artillery within range of interdicting Henderson Field. They recognize the Japanese capability of marching to the jungle to attack from the south, but they believe that the Japanese do that, they'll come up so exhausted and disorganized that the attack will not be well mounted. Well, it turns out that the Japanese do march to the south. They have a horrendous march. They repeatedly had to postpone their attack, but finally, on the night of the 24th, 25th of October 1942, they mount their attack. It's very disorganized. It becomes famous for the stand by Sergeant John Bazelon and his machine gun detachment, which mows down enormous numbers of Japanese. The Japanese army renews the attack the next couple nights. They are defeated, however, although there's some close run moments, and they suffer a very serious defeat that very seriously depletes the 2nd Sendai Division. Meanwhile, the two navies are squaring off offshore. Admiral Halsey, to show his commitment to the American forces, decides to send his carriers into combat, although they're outnumbered 2 to 4 against the Japanese naval task force. As you can see from this slide, the disparity in aircraft complement, however, is not quite so severe. The Santa Cruz Islands is a ferociously fought battle in which basically what you see in the 4 carrier battles of 1942, the Americans are doing better on the defense than on the offense, and in the battle the Americans lose the carrier Hornet. They come awfully close to losing the other carrier, the Enterprise, which would have been a real catastrophe. The aircraft losses don't seem to be all that far apart, but once again, the aircrew losses are astonishingly lopsided, with the Japanese losing no fewer than 148 aircrew. This is more than like the 110 Japanese aircrew that are lost in Battle of Midway, and this becomes a Pyrrhic victory for the Japanese. At the end of this battle, we have wounded Enterprise still operational, and the Japanese effectively, due to aircraft losses, are reduced to 1 aircraft carrier to support the November battles. Now, it's time for the Japanese to once again rethink their situation and what are they going to do. There is some sentiment that basically they should give up, but they press ahead. And why do they do that? Well, they believe that they were awfully close to success in October. They believe that the sea battle, Santa Cruz Islands, was a much more decided and lopsided victory for the Japanese than in fact it was. And not least of all was the fruits of the American decision back in October to release far more candid and indeed dire information about what our situation was. It encourages the Japanese to believe if they press ahead one more time, they're sure to succeed. And this leads to the big showdown in November 1942. The Japanese decide to rephrase their October plan. They're once again going to mount an air campaign followed by a battleship bombardment to knock out those pesky American airplanes on Guadalcanal. Then they're going to move in a huge reinforcement convoy. This convoy, by the way, is not going to contain overwhelming numbers of troops, but will contain a very large backlog of supplies, because the Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal are now calling it Starvation Island because of the severity of their supply shortage that's accumulated over the last 3 months. On the American side, the plan is to run in our own reinforcements and to block the Japanese from doing the same. We get a breakthrough in radio intelligence that gives us some idea of what the Japanese are doing, but it's by no means a complete picture. This leads to what's called the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. It begins on the 12th of November with the Japanese air attack on the American reinforcement convoy, which fortunately is beaten off. That night, in the early morning hours of Friday the 13th, an American naval task force, hastily assembled under Admiral Daniel Callahan, takes on the Japanese bombardment force. As you can see from this slide, because the Japanese are bringing 2 battleships to this action, the Japanese have a very clear preponderance not only in gunfire, but they also have a very clear preponderance in torpedo power. The American task force hurdles itself against the Japanese. It's not elegant, but it works. This is a slide of the American flagship, the cruiser San Francisco. Those little white circles on the ship mark some of the 45 gunfire hits that will strike San Francisco during this action. There will be 25 fires burning on the ship, and over 500 tons of seawater in places where it's not supposed to be. The hits on the bridge of the San Francisco kill not only Admiral Callahan, they kill almost all of his staff or incapacitate them. The captain of the San Francisco is killed. The executive officer of the San Francisco is killed. The acting executive officer of the San Francisco is killed. The navigator, who is the next officer in command, he is severely wounded. He's hurtled off the navigation bridge by a hit, lands on the main deck next to a 5-inch gun mount. The sailors believe he's dead and tosses his body to the side. The only surviving officer now on the bridge of the San Francisco is a 31-year-old lieutenant commander named Bruce McCandless. Bruce McCandless realizes that not only has he effectively succeeded to command of the San Francisco because of his position on the navigating bridge, he also realizes that in this incredibly confused battle, with communications out and chaos all around, that the rest of the ships of the task force will steer by what the flagship of the task force does. He tells a sailor who has grabbed the helm from the hands of the dying, from a helmsman who has been killed, to turn the ship's head back around to head right back into the middle of the Japanese task force. For this action, McCandless is going to receive a well-earned Medal of Honor, and this is a critical moment because it does eventually break the Japanese nerve, the nerve of the Japanese Admiral Abe, and the Japanese battleship bombardment of the airfield is aborted. The Americans at great cost have thwarted this, but this only buys a respite, not a victory. The following day, the Japanese send down a cruiser force to attempt to bombard the American airfield. Although they bombard, their aim is very poor and they basically miss. During November 14th, the main convoy, which is sent ahead because the Japanese now believe they have knocked out the American airfield, is pummeled by American air power, both those at Guadalcanal and aircraft from the carrier Enterprise, which steams up and lends her aircraft to support. Halsey is now down to effectively his last ships. He has only the ships guarding the Enterprise. It includes 2 battleships, modern battleships, the Washington, the South Dakota, and he puts them together with a scratch task force of 4 destroyers and sends them forth to do battle one more time to defend the Marines and now the soldiers on Guadalcanal. This leads to a battleship action on the night of November 14th, November 15th. The American Admiral Lee versus Japanese Admiral Kondo. Here again, you see the basic numbers on the forces. This time the Americans have a significant advantage in gunfire, but not in torpedo power. This is Admiral Willis A. Lee. Lee is among flag officers of that period, 1942, is rare in terms of he fully understands radar. He also has an amazing mental facility to keep track in his own mind of naval maneuvers to a degree that few other naval officers, much less flag officers, have. His flagship, the beautiful battleship Washington, is eventually going to find itself fighting the battle alone. The San Francisco is severely damaged and withdraws. 3 of the 4 American destroyers are sunk or will be sunk in the battle, and they're knocked out of it. And eventually Washington is taking on the whole Japanese task force, but under Lee's guidance, Washington wins. At this point, American gloom about Guadalcanal turns to joy. In fact, I should point out that according to Assistant Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, as we head into the naval battle of Guadalcanal, the tension in the White House is at a level that will not be seen to be exceeded except on the eve of the D-Day Normandy landing in June 1944. However, we do emerge triumphant from the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Secretary of the Navy Knox, who had been a doomsayer on this, now announces we will win, but immediately we're given a comeuppance. At the very end of November, the Japanese send down one more destroyer run to resupply the Japanese garrison. They meet a superior American cruiser-destroyer force and basically humiliate them in a battle called the Battle of Tassafaronga. Now, this whole pattern of these 5 major night actions that take place off Guadalcanal underline a very fundamental aspect about surface naval warfare between the U.S. and the Imperial Japanese navies in World War II. The Japanese had anticipated that as part of their strategy for fighting a Pacific War, that they were going to have to engage in a lot of night battle, which is what the weaker side normally attempts to do. And they had worked very assiduously on their tactics, on their equipment, and they trained very rigorously for this. With respect to equipment, they'd worked very hard on developing visual lookouts, and they also had developed the most powerful and effective torpedoes called the Long Lance, 24 inches in diameter, which were by far and away the best torpedoes in the world. The American Navy had gleaned from radio intercepts some idea about what the Japanese were going to do, but they basically did not properly mount an effort to fully counter this with respect to equipment and particularly with training. The Navy was continuously caught on the wrong foot with respect to fighting at night with scratch forces and without a thoroughgoing doctrine or equipment. Now, many people think that radar is sort of this automatic panacea, that's the magic formula, elixir that will guarantee victory. Here I've paraphrased Sun Tzu as to what ultimately is going to happen in World War II when you fall behind in radar. But during these night surface actions off Guadalcanal, you'll notice that on at least 2 of the 5 occasions, the Japanese actually see the Americans first visually before American radar picks up the Japanese. And usually the side that gains the upper hand, that sights the enemy first, has the upper hand. And that's how the ship fighting goes in those ferocious night naval battles at Guadalcanal. December comes, and the Japanese face yet another decision about what to do at Guadalcanal. And amazingly, initially, they're all in for yet another effort to retake Guadalcanal. But as the months and days go on, the Japanese recalculate. Basically, what it comes down to is the amount of shipping required to sustain the level of combat they're contemplating to renew an offensive at Guadalcanal and the Solomons would basically mortgage the entire Japanese war economy. And saner views finally prevailed that that simply is unacceptable because it would wreck the Japanese war economy for 1943, and they decide to withdraw. The Japanese withdrawal is very successful. It's the best part of their operations on Guadalcanal. The Americans obviously have an enormous intelligence failure in terms of sensing what the Japanese are up to. To my mind, however, it's kind of hard to fault the Americans because, once again, the Japanese have 4 times attempted to retake Guadalcanal. They are thinking about doing a 5th. It would be very hard for anyone to have casually thought the Japanese were about to withdraw. The American operations, with now the Army providing the preponderance of forces, is pretty restrained and cautious. The Japanese stage what's effectively a brilliant withdrawal and get about 10,000 of the 37,000 troops they committed to Guadalcanal off the island. Guadalcanal is going to be most significant with respect to its attrition, particularly for Japanese aircraft. This reflects the aircraft losses, but what's more significant is the Japanese accept battle under very difficult circumstances at very long range, and their aircrew losses are going to be vastly higher than the American aircrew losses. The warship losses are ferocious. The waters adjacent to the north shore of Guadalcanal will be called Iron Bottom Sound because there's no other place on Earth that has the remains of so many ships as that little stretch of water in about the 25-mile radius of Henderson Field. When it comes to actual deaths during the campaign, you'll notice that although the Americans sustain a lot fewer deaths than the Japanese, and although the Americans lose a lot fewer airmen than the Japanese, American naval losses among naval personnel are very more than the Japanese. And what is more, although the campaign is going to be associated with the Marine Corps for the basically all eternity, the simple fact is that for every Marine who perishes on Guadalcanal, about 3 sailors are going to die. Now, there's a lot of argument about the significance of Guadalcanal, particularly versus Midway. And this is one way, as I view it, to look at it. Basically, Midway halts the Japanese offensive of the Central Pacific. It also defeats the strategy that Yamamoto had. His long-range concept was not only to win at Midway, but to seize the Hawaiian Islands and use those as a bargaining chip to secure negotiated peace. Now, whether that was sound or not, that was at least his aim. And of course, Midway has very catastrophic losses to Japanese aircraft carriers, although not so much the aircrew as is sometimes made out. By contrast, at Guadalcanal, the Japanese are still on the offensive, certainly in New Guinea in 1942. The campaign is going to reverse the strategic posture of the 2 combatants, and it's going to cause pretty much irreparable attrition to Japanese air and light naval forces. Midway and Guadalcanal together have global strategic significance. The one great American nightmare, which Brigadier General Dwight D. Eisenhower in a memo in early 1942 notes, is that there'll be a link up of the Axis forces across the Indian Ocean. Eisenhower is going to identify this as one of the three great tasks that the U.S. must achieve in order to win. And these are keeping the British in the war, keeping the Soviets in the war, and preventing a link up of the Germans and the Japanese. A link up of two of the most sinister forces in the 20th century. I use this in the Naval War College talk to make sure people are awake. This is the notion that the Japanese and the Germans will forge in some fashion a link up across the Indian Ocean. Now, it's not so simple as the Japanese being able to move major naval forces or ground forces to the coast of Africa, but the ability to interdict the sea lanes coming around the east coast of Africa would have had very dire effect on the Allied cause. It would have collapsed the British position in the Middle East, the British position in India, and with it the position of the Chinese. It would have been a total catastrophe for the Allied cause, and undoubtedly at least prolonged the war, if not changed its outcome. There was a very chilling intercept of a Japanese message in September 1942 showing that Hitler himself, who had originally discarded the idea of a link up across the Indian Ocean in early 1942 for the Stalingrad campaign, but by September, when he thinks Stalingrad is going to be a German victory, he's advising the Japanese that he thinks the next step is going to be this link up across the Indian Ocean. It must have been very chilling for any American strategist to read. And finally, we come to what I'd like to emphasize even more in some of my later talks about what Guadalcanal had as significance. It was the first American land offensive during the war, but more important than that, it was to the American people what they regarded as the first fair test of the generation that would fight the war. Places like Wake or Guam or the Philippines were not regarded as a fair test of the American fighting capability, given the circumstances under which those American forces fought. Guadalcanal was that fair test, and it was followed with riveted attention by the American public, particularly from October to November. And how it was viewed by the generation that fought the war was this. Although later we are going to talk about places like Normandy or Iwo Jima a lot more, Guadalcanal was the place where what we're going to call later the greatest generation really proved its mettle, showed that it could prevail fighting an Axis power at the peak of its effectiveness under conditions of adversity. And Guadalcanal was, above all, a campaign that was not won by numerical preponderance. It was very closely run. How Guadalcanal was viewed, I think, was captured in the Victory at Sea episode on Guadalcanal. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Chrissy to show that the last 90-some seconds of that episode, which really shows how it was viewed by the generation that fought the war.
All right, so folks, you'll see your screen change a little bit here, and we're going to be loading up this clip that Rich mentioned, and starting here shortly.
Being relieved, what's left of it. And on a lonely grave at Lunga Point, there is a prediction about the Marine who lost his youth, that when he goes to heaven, to St. Peter he will tell.
All right, so with that, Rich, do you have any other closing thoughts, or should we move to questions?
Just saying that's a pretty powerful statement right there. The Greeks at Thermopylae, the British at Waterloo, the colonials at Valley Forge, that's a pretty high pantheon they're putting the Guadalcanal campaign in. And once again, that's how the generation that fought the war saw Guadalcanal. And with that, yes, let's move on to questions.
Fantastic. Well, I think actually your webcam might have gone away during the presentation. I'm going to start mine up again here too, so that if you wouldn't mind starting yours up again as well, so we can see.
Let me see. I'm not getting a screen up of what have I got here. Just a second. Let me see if I can get.
All right, I'll give you a second, and we can have a chat, because I've gotten a lot of great questions from the audience. Thank you all so much for your participation. You can keep them coming and flowing on in here if you'd like as well, because I'll still be kind of watching the Q&A area as Rich starts up his webcam. So.
I don't know whether I'm going to have to come back in. Oh, here we go. Here I am. There. Have you got me now?
I don't see you yet, but let's give it a second to pop it up. So I'm going to give my computer a second to work.
My camera's come back on.
Oh, there we go. We can see you now.
Okay.
Okay, so Rich, I've got a lot of questions coming in, and folks, for those of y'all who are tuning in with us, I know we are at 12:55 Central Time, but I feel like I have so many good ones. If you have time to stay on the line, maybe we'll go a little bit after 1 o'clock.
I was going to say, Chrissy, I'd be happy to indulge and keep going here.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so first of many questions here. This first one comes from Corky, and he asks, did the Marines that first landed at Tulagi also then proceed on the same day to Guadalcanal? Was that all on the 7th of August?
The operations were all on the 7th of August. The Marines had divided their forces. They sent part of the 1st Marine Division reinforced over to Tulagi and the adjacent islands of Gavutu and Tanambago. That was because the Japanese had a seaplane base there, and Tulagi had actually been the seat of the British colonial government. And it had originally been in the order. Tulagi was identified as a target. The main part of the landing force, however, was the Marine contingent that went to Guadalcanal. And I would note, for all the sometimes criticism about how the Marines supposedly were into frontal attacks, if you look at the Marine operations in this initial landing, you'll notice that every place where they had a reasonable choice about whether to land away from a major opposition and maneuver onto the target or not, they chose to do so, except at Gavutu, which really basically there was no maneuver option. It was straight up the middle to where the Japanese were ensconced on the island.
All right, and then the next one from Stephen, he's asking how important was the role of the Air Force forward observers, who are, what would become the Air Force forward observers, whose responsibility it was to call in air support?
Well, in 1942, both the American Navy, Naval Services, the Marines and the Navy, and the Army Air Forces were very, very rudimentary in terms of their forward air controlling, as it would later become to be called. It was very limited, and I can't really say that the Army Air Force, or for that matter the Navy, the Marines, were able to provide anything like the sophisticated direct call of air support. Most of it was prearranged. There was efforts made to designate targets for aircraft, but by the standards of what comes later, it's an extremely rudimentary level of support.
All right, and then I have a couple questions coming in from folks just wanting to know. So first off, we'll start with the broader one. Tom is wondering how many Congressional Medals of Honor were awarded during this campaign. And then Joseph wanted to know some specific information about Mitchell Page and his Medal of Honor actions.
Offhand, I'm not sure. I think it was probably about 10 or so total Medals of Honor, but I'd have to go back and check. I don't remember off the top of my hand. Most of them were Navy and Marine Corps, primarily because the Army came in much later. Mitchell Page basically did approximately the same thing that John Basilone did, only one night later. Like Basilone, he was the head of a machine gun section. I've often described Basilone and Mitchell Page, for that matter. They were much like sort of a shop foreman in those days in a in American industry. And these were guys who would have no college, but were very shrewd individuals who were mechanically very adept, who knew every single detail with respect to the equipment they were dealing with, like Bazelon or Page did, with respect to a machine gun. And they usually had a pretty sound tactical sense and a pretty good sense of how to manage people. Both Mitchell Page and Bazelon would be awarded the Medal of Honor. Bazelon would be sent back for war bond tours. Let me give a plug here to the HBO series, The Pacific. I think they do a really fine job of capturing Bazelon as a character and showing what he does, and then later his decision to go back out to the Pacific, where he's going to be killed at Iwo Jima. It probably says something about the thinking of the Marine Corps officers that they decided to keep Mitchell Page out in the Pacific. And I think Mitchell Page, who's going to retire eventually as a colonel in the Marine Corps, was a man who was fitted for moving up to higher commands. Bazelon was a wonderful Marine, a wonderful non-com, but I don't see him as being capable of serving at higher echelons.
Okay, so next from Merlin, he was asking, so was Fletcher justified in withdrawing the carrier task force, and was Turner justified in withdrawing the transports after Savo Island?
Well, that's a very interesting case. You know, literally for decades, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher got pummeled because he withdrew aircraft carriers from support of the landing, actually on the evening of August 8th, the second day after the landing itself. My good friend and colleague John Lundstrom got into the deep weeds of what went on and provides a rather different picture about what actually happened. I mentioned earlier that the command conference before the landing was quite tumultuous. The basic reason is that, as I mentioned, Fletcher, unlike certainly Admiral King, believed that the Japanese were not going to simply roll over for a landing on Guadalcanal. He believed the Japanese would come out with all guns blazing to retake the island. He also knew that he had the last three American carriers in the Pacific, well, I should say 3 of the 4. The aircraft on those carriers he had no means of replacing because the logistics were not in place, and he believed the Japanese would come in and he would have to fight a carrier battle to preserve the American position, including the Marines' position on Guadalcanal. Now, the other aspect about this is that the only thing that Fletcher knew about what was happening on Guadalcanal was from Fletcher's operation plan, because as John showed, basically none of the messages that Turner attempted to send or did send got through to Fletcher to explain that unloading had bogged down and was going way behind schedule. According to Turner's operations plan, on the evening of August 8th, the great majority of the transports in the covering force was going to withdraw and leaving only a small contingent behind. Meanwhile, Japanese aircraft from Naval had made an appearance, and Fletcher, believing that Turner was still operating on the original plan he'd been given, believed he had to preserve the carriers for this great carrier battle. So Fletcher withdrew, and of course, ever since, he was severely pummeled for that decision. Of course, he ended up having to fight that carrier battle at Eastern Solomons exactly as predicted. So I think a lot more sympathy is due to him than typically has been given. Admiral Turner, once the carriers withdrew and after the covering force is shattered at the Battle of Savo Island, had no realistic option but to withdraw the main part of the transport force. Throughout the campaign, the ability of the Americans to maintain themselves on Guadalcanal was dependent upon using basically the amphibious lift. This were ships that could get up there and use landing craft to put supplies ashore. There were no docks, no facilities, no way to manhandle significant cargo across the beaches. So loss of those amphibious vessels would have been a catastrophe akin to losing the airfield on Guadalcanal. So they were both justified in what they did, however horrendous it was for the Marines on Guadalcanal.
All right, and the next one comes from Dave. This is an interesting one. He says, since the cruisers were destroyed, what sort of supplies were left for the fighters? Did they rely on raiding Japanese camps for food and ammunition?
You know, that's a very interesting point because, as I mentioned earlier, the unloading for the transport force for the Marines ashore had lagged way behind what the original plan was, and the Marines had only part of their supplies, only part of their equipment. They did find a lot of Japanese supplies around Guadalcanal, around the airfield site. The Japanese had a couple of construction units that were building the airfield. This was rice. They also found a rather large supply of sake. Interestingly enough, the official historians tend to dwell upon the rice but don't mention the sake. The Marines I've talked to told me that they did manage to find time to also imbibe the sake. There really is only a few days of supplies that gets ashore. The Marines immediately go on a 2-meal-a-day schedule. Partly this is because the Japanese begin almost daily air raids. And because the Japanese have to fly down from Naval, it effectively, and then want to get back before nightfall, this locks them into a pattern in which their aircraft are over the island mostly around the, noontime, 1 o'clock. So the Marines decide to forego lunch to eat a morning meal and an evening meal before darkness falls, and they have to go on alert against whatever the Japanese are up to at night.
Interesting. And then Jane is asking, how did African American soldiers participate in the efforts at Guadalcanal?
Well, there are no African American soldiers who are actually going to be ashore, as far as I know, during the campaign itself. Guadalcanal is going to be turned into an enormous American base complex that's going to be used throughout the war. Units are going to stage out of Guadalcanal for the Okinawa campaign in April 1945. That's how important the base becomes. And it will have a large number of support and service troops that will include a large number of African Americans. Now, that said about African American troops ashore, bear in mind that all the major Navy ships had typically African Americans aboard. At this stage of the war, they are typically limited to work as in the mess cook area. But they are there, they do serve. One of them gets a Navy Cross on the Enterprise. They only get, in the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, they give out 3 Navy Crosses on the Enterprise. One of them goes to an African American steward's mate. And one of the, I mean, obviously it's very heroic, but what's interesting is part of the criteria is he's a very small guy, and he lifts a very big white guy and carries him up multiple ladders up to a topside position. I mean, the physical feat that this guy performs is just astonishing all by itself. Later on, you're going to have Marines, black Marines who are going to come ashore and others. But during this phase of the war, the action ashore on Guadalcanal, as far as I know, consists nothing but or non-blacks. This is not to say that there aren't plenty of Hispanics in the ranks of the Marines and the Army forces on Guadalcanal.
Okay, so I've got a couple questions about the Japanese air crewmen. Just one from Charles and Jim. So Jim, kind of a kind of broader aspect. He wants to know, why are their losses so much higher than U.S. losses? And Charles is wondering, is that due to the adherence to Bushido?
There's a series of factors that are involved in this. The first and probably the most significant factor is this. When the Americans land on Guadalcanal, the nearest Japanese air base is on Rabaul. Rabaul is like 550 miles away. The Americans, when they're defending Guadalcanal, are normally flying proximate to Guadalcanal and Henderson Field. Particularly the American fighter planes that are defending Henderson Field are going to be nearby. If an American fighter plane is shot down or another plane is shot down, it's going to be near Guadalcanal. It's going to be much more likely that that air crew is going to survive and be rescued. The Japanese, on the other hand, have these incredibly long, arduous flights that take them hours from Rabaul down to Guadalcanal and then back. What this means is that the air crew become exhausted, which has its own factor in terms of losses. And secondly, Japanese aircraft that are damaged are much less likely to be able to complete the total transit from Rabaul down and back. And if they splash anywhere along the Solomons on the route back, their chances of survival and rescue are very, very slim. Japanese aircraft also are designed at this stage of the war. They don't have much armor plate, if any, or self-sealing gas tanks, which means they're much more prone to catch fire, which means the catastrophic loss of the aircraft and typically the air crew. It's not so much simply the Bushido code that supposedly results in the loss of Japanese flyers, but much more these various material factors involving distance and types of Japanese aircrafts that are going to produce these enormous disparity in losses.
Okay, and then I've got a little more kind of pop culture one for you from Rudy. Thin red line. Do you say it's accurate?
Which one? The novel
Didn't
by,
specify.
okay, the novel by James Jones, I think, is really superb. He was at the peak of his powers. It's an incredibly acute depiction of men at war. It is also extremely, it's very interesting because James Jones writes a novel, and how many novels really have an introduction by the author? And in that introduction, James Jones gets to a point I made. He says that he's going to change the names of some of the locations on Guadalcanal, but he's going to maintain the identity of Guadalcanal because, as he said, what Guadalcanal meant to his generation was a very special thing. James Jones arrives as a member of the Company F 27th Infantry Regiment of the 25th Division. They're going to fight in the final drives to expel the Japanese from Guadalcanal in January and February 1943. James Jones' novel is actually a very lightly masked account of what his rifle company does, Company F 27th Infantry. If you know what Company F does and you read the novel, you see it's almost an exact depiction of what happens there. The novel was made into two movies, one in the 1960s, which was sort of ho-hum. The second, which was much more celebrated, was made by Terrence Malick, and it came out in the about 2000. Malick's version takes the novel and basically turns the novel, which is basically depicting men at war, and has a lot to say about ecology and race. My short-lived career as a movie reviewer for the History Channel came to an end because I basically observed that I liked the novel a lot more than Terrence Malick's movie, and that was the end of my career there.
That's a good story. All right, so Kent has a true or false for you. He was asking, he's wondering, MacArthur abandoned the Marines at Guadalcanal, writing the campaign off as lost. Is that true or is that false?
Well, basically, what was going on? There were two campaigns in that area of the Pacific. While the Marines and the Army are fighting on Guadalcanal, the Japanese actually initially are staging this overland march on the island of New Guinea, which is, of course, the larger island just north of Australia. The Japanese are striking towards Port Moresby. Having been frustrated originally in their attempt to take it by sea at the Battle of Coral Sea, they launched this overland march along the Kokoda Trail. This is going on simultaneously with the Guadalcanal campaign, and initially the Japanese efforts on New Guinea are prioritized. Certainly the Imperial Army regards it as more important than the Guadalcanal campaign. So indirectly, the fact that this distracts the Japanese away from Guadalcanal for at least 2 months is probably a very good thing for the Marines on Guadalcanal. It's not so much that MacArthur is neglecting them, it's that MacArthur has his hands full, he and the Australians, holding the Japanese on New Guinea. MacArthur, like people in Washington, becomes very pessimistic about the prospects for American success on Guadalcanal, and is worried that as soon as the Japanese are successful on Guadalcanal, they're going to return full force to the New Guinea campaign. So these two campaigns are closely related, and I really wouldn't say that General MacArthur, whatever else you can say about him, is really is trying to undermine the effort on Guadalcanal, although obviously he clearly believes that he and he alone should be in command of American Pacific strategy.
Okay, and then try to see how many more we can fit in before we, are extending people's lunch hour a little too long here.
Sure.
Okay, so how about this one from Kay? Were the Navajo code talkers involved in Guadalcanal?
Yes, they were there. When I was doing my research on the book, there were a couple of records that basically were not released, or at least I was not able to locate, one of which involved the very earliest efforts of these Navajo code talkers. They were definitely present on Guadalcanal, of course. They're going to be very important for the Marines, as well as other Native Americans who serve in this capacity. And basically, for those who are not familiar with this story, what this involves is that these Navajo and other Native Americans are employed as voice radio operators, because they can talk in their native language, which of course is, the Americans are quite convinced, and properly so, that basically nobody else is going to know it. The code talkers invent some terms to deal with military terms they have to deal with, like tanks and things like that. But basically gives the Americans a big advantage in terms of secure voice communications. And voice communications, because they're very rapid, are extremely important in tactical operations.
Okay, so we're at 1:14 Central. So, Rich, I may have that one be the last question, and I might just close out with a couple reminders. Is that okay with you?
Well, let's take one more, or one or two more, because people.
All right, that sounds good. Okay, so I have a personal one from Kent that he just wanted to share this. He says, "Do you know the story of Daniel A. Joy and how he died?" He said he was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross and had a destroyer escort named after him. He said his father was his foxhole buddy. Any info on that?
No, that specific story I'm not familiar with. No, but
Okay.
I will say that one thing about the Guadalcanal campaign is that in the naval service at that day, the nomenclature standards were that destroyers and destroyer escorts were named after what were broadly classified as naval heroes, or in some cases naval inventors or other people who have contributed enormously to the naval service. And you'll find that the destroyers and destroyer escorts that are commissioned after the Guadalcanal campaign, an enormous number of them are named after individuals who served at Guadalcanal, who received decorations at the level of a Navy Cross or higher.
Okay, and then Don, this is kind of another sort of general question from Don. If you could share maybe some details or stories about the psychological impact of Guadalcanal on, these soldiers and Marines. She said, when she thinks of Guadalcanal, she thinks of like these grimacing kind of images of these men, in that campaign on the island. And if you could just elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, there's absolutely no doubt that between August and November, the Americans, first all Marines, and later some soldiers are going to arrive starting in October and into November, are facing extraordinarily severe circumstances. First of all, they're on very short rations. They're not at starvation level like the Japanese are, but you see pictures of Marines who've served on Guadalcanal for any length of time after August, and they're very slender, very thin. You can count their ribs. There's a couple of photos that particularly bring this home. So the simple physical privation of lack of food is very prominent. Secondly, the Japanese make a regular practice of trying to disturb the sleep of Americans, both with these naval bombardments and also by sending aircraft over at night to randomly drop bombs simply to keep Americans up and exhaust them. They do a very good job of that. So sleeping is also another aspect about the deprivation that the forces on the island are facing. And of course, the bombardments, naval bombardments are especially terrifying because naval guns are much bigger than the average type of artillery piece that's going to be used on land, particularly the type of artillery pieces the Japanese can bring to bear. That battleship bombardment, as I mentioned, is the most severe bombardment I think American forces ever faced. So it's not surprising that this combination, plus on top of that, the air raids and the repeated Japanese offensives and the sense that they're isolated and cut off and basically orphaned by the Navy, is an overwhelming psychological toll on all of these individuals. It simply is a remarkable indicator of the sort of grit that they have, that they hang on under those circumstances. And this again gets back to why, to the generation that fought the war, this was such a big deal. I mean, this is not prevailing when you outnumber the enemy 3-1, or 4-1, or 10-1. This is prevailing when you're on the very knife edge of 1-to-1 odds, with the other guy having a leg up at various points in the air or at sea. This is a very close run thing. It could have gone either way between August and November, and very nearly did. So it's no wonder that the men who were ashore, their faces, their bodies reflected that fact.
Well, Rich, thank you for that. I think we hit most of the questions, other than folks are sharing, how many medals of honor they found online at Guadalcanal. So you've some folks researching here on the back end too. So I want to just close out and just with a couple reminders. So I'm going to share my screen one more time. So you should hopefully see that switch over here in a second. So reminder number one, when it displays, let's give it a second, there we go, is our upcoming webinar. This is the first of a series, folks, as you know, and so part 2 coming up with James Hornfisher. We were going to have it on Labor Day because we wanted to do the first Monday of the month, but I don't think that's going to work for folks with barbecues and cookouts and whatnot. So it's going to be Thursday, September 7th from 12 to 1, and then closing it out with Dr. Rob Citino here at the museum for part 3. You can see the registration links there. I will send those also via email. And then, as I said in the beginning, one last reminder about Rich's book here at the museum web store. If you don't have it in your hands yet, you can still get it, of course, and we're offering, of course, a 20% discount as well by just using that code webinar. That's actually all I have for me today. Rich, any kind of closing thoughts?
No, I think we've covered the universe with respect to Guadalcanal, and I want to thank everyone for signing up for this program. And I hope that the museum will continue to put these on and reach out to an ever wider audience.
Oh yeah, that's we for sure will. You know, as I said, this is how we fulfill our national mission. Even if you can't physically come here to the museum, you'll be able to virtually connect with us in a lot of different ways. So really excited for you all to participate with us. And thank you so much for joining us on this very special commemorative day. And Rich, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and sticking around to answer all these great questions. We really appreciate it here.
I'm very pleased to do so. And let me just add, when you get a chance to go to the museum, the Road to Tokyo exhibit has one whole gallery about Guadalcanal, which is basically give you a sensual experience of what it was like with palm trees, theatrical lighting to give you the filtered light of the jungle, sort of a roughened floor like you're walking along the ground at Guadalcanal, and a tremendous set of videos, artifacts, and images from the campaign. It's definitely one of the high points of the museum exhibits.
And you should see actually an image of that, just one image of the exhibit here at the museum. We'll be showing some more of that as we get to Dr. Rob Citino's talk on the third for the third part. So, well, from Chrissy here at the National World War II Museum, and of course, Rich Frank as well, we want to say thank you so much for tuning in with us today. We really appreciate your participation, and we'll see you September 7th for part 2. Thanks, and bye, everyone.